This is the HALOCK Security Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Terry Kurzynski, and I am joined by Dr. Preston Rich. Do you go by Doc? Go by Rich?
Preston.
Dr. Preston?
Preston works.
Preston. So, Preston, and kind of doing a little research for this podcast, and it looks like you've been either associate professor, adjunct professor, visiting professor at like over a half a dozen or more organizations. So
Correct.
tell me how did that start? How did you get into that?
Well, when I graduated, when I got my MBA, I was looking I was looking to be an adjunct somewhere because I was actually working on my PhD and writing my dissertation. So I felt, well, I have an MBA in strategic leadership. Let me go and teach. And the only place that would hire me at the time was a community college. I went to the community college, and one of my professors was talking about relationships. One of my old professors that I had when I was 10 years before, when I was getting an associate degree, Randy Waterman, she said, "Hey, I remember you." And she hand walked my resume to the dean of business. And she said, "I've known this young man. I've taught this young man. Give him a shot." And it was usually they hire adjuncts in the fall. I was actually hired in the winter, which is in between the two falls.
Yeah.
And I was put on, and I was an adjunct. Dr. Linda Marble gave me a shot at Richland College, and well, it's called Dallas College now because they put all the campuses together. And I started teaching in the business department, principles of management and principles of supervision. And I did that from 2008. I did that for 12 years. I went to Richland College. I taught at Dallas College. Then I went to Collin College because I actually live in Collin County, a little further north. And I actually graduated from I actually graduated from a Dallas college called Eastfield when I got my associates.
Okay.
So I went to Collin College, and I had applied several times. And one day, a lady, I called to say, "Hey, I see this advertisement here for an adjunct for management. I put my application in 4 times. Nobody's called me. Do you know the dean or anybody?" They gave me a number to Dr. Christine Delatorre, and she called me. She said, "Hey, I heard you want to teach here. Go ahead and apply." I said, "I have 4 times." And she goes, "What?" So she goes back and looks in the archives, and quite frankly, they changed systems from one system to another, so all the resumes didn't come over. They were going through a conversion. So she went in and pulled out my resume and gave me an interview, and I started teaching there. And then after that, about 2020, in that time frame, I earned my PhD and graduated in 2014. And then I still kept teaching there, but my whole goal was to go to a 4-year university. And it was in 2020, right before the pandemic, where I said, "I'm resigning from all community colleges, and I'm going to apply for some 4-year universities." And I applied and got picked up. Parker University, then DeVry, and then Grand Canyon, and then Purdue. So,
what I'm getting is a lesson in persistence, because you didn't give up on any of those pursuits,
Yeah, persistence and building relationships, So you got to understand about building relationships with people. I mean, again, the whole reason I got into it was because I was sitting as a student in one of my professor's classes who happened to still be at the school when I went to the job fair to say I wanted to be an adjunct. So they gave me my first kicks into the door, and then I've just been doing it ever since.
Well, let me get into some of the curriculum stuff. So I know you mentioned, business material, business major kind of, in the beginning. What in the last, 10 years, it sounds like it's been more, you and I talked more cyber and information security related. Give me an idea of what that curriculum looks like and, that's being taught now.
Well, I've run the gamut. I usually you get into business and technology, business and info technology courses.
Yeah.
And when you're new, they start giving you networking courses, right? So, hey, I want you to do the networking course. And then what I used to do is when I would
And do you mean networking people or networking and computers and technology?
No, computer networking, OSI model.
Got
this is a router, this is a switch, this is the firewall. So I was teaching that, and I saw that there was a hole, there was a gap there. So I was teaching them about firewalls, but I'm like, well, do you know what this firewall is supposed to do? And they were like, well, no, we don't know. And then I started introducing ports. And then I said, well, they need to know about ports. And I talked to my folks. I'm like, we need to put something more in here about common ports and why you do this and why you do that and controls. And it went from there to yes, do controls to, well, first thing you need to do is figure out where you're risky. Well, how do we do that? Well, we need to have a risk assessment. And then that whole thing from the middle of the semester to the end, I tied security into every piece of my networking assignments until the dean said, you really like security? I'm like, yeah. So he started giving me security classes. But it was a thing where what we're missing is that we tell the students that information security is very important. And we tell them IT is very important. But we never tell them there's a difference between the two. Yeah. There's a difference between the two, and they work together in a symbiotic relationship. However, you need to ensure that when you're implementing networking, you're implementing security with networking. And as we're going faster and faster and getting more products and more products out there, we need to be able to, you should not be able to deploy IT infrastructure without considering security.
Well, let me ask this question. So I've been in cybersecurity since the 90s, and early on there was, you had, kind of networking people, you had application dev guys, maybe you still had mainframe and mid-range guys around, they all had their boxes, and the security guy was responsible for security. We all know that that doesn't work. Everyone has to have and think about their integrated security component. Everything we do has to have security. But from your perspective in the schools, when did that mind shift? Did you witness when that may have happened, or has it even happened in the schools? I guess
it hasn't happened yet, Terry. I hate to tell you that, but it hasn't happened. I mean, we have courses. If you don't have a particular professor that has actually been in the field to actually do that, they don't get that piece. The students don't get that piece. It's straight what the syllabus says, which I go by the syllabus, but I have to integrate the security into it, and basically. That hasn't happened yet, but I do have some appointments with some course developers to say, hey, the next time you guys edit this course or review this course for additions, let's talk about putting security in. And it's very refreshing to see schools like Purdue and Grand Canyon saying, yeah, they can see the light in the tunnel, but they don't know how to get there. So it's more of a thing where then I take off my security hat and put on my organization and management PhD hat, and I say, okay, here's the structure of the organization. We need to change the structure of the organization to foster information security or cybersecurity, whichever one you choose, to be just as important to the organization as HR. It's a staff function. It's not a line function, much like HR is a staff function, overarching. And one of the CEOs, I can't tell you the company, one of the CEOs came to me and said, why do you make it seem as though cybersecurity is so important like HR when really it's just something that's under IT? I said, well, if one of your people goes out and violates HIPAA or violates a Civil Rights Act or civil rights law, what happens? He says, well, we get sued and we lose a lot of money. I said, okay, if somebody breaches your organization and breaches your network and steals your data and shuts your data out and forces you to pay a ransom to get it back, what do you have to do? He says, I'll probably have to pay a lot of money. And then when you get your data back and your customers find out that you were the reason why their data is breached and they sue you, then what? And he sat back and he got it. He went, wait a minute. Security is in everything. I'm like, that part. And it's no longer a thing where you can shove us under the IT line as a line item to say that that's IT. The Colonial Pipeline situation was one of the major issues and one of the major events in our history, recent history, where we saw that, Terry.
Yeah.
Nerdy.
The silo of duties. Right. Is that what you're saying?
Right. It's the silo of duties, but this is the reason why I like this podcast, because you're talking about a new concept. You're talking about cyber leadership. Okay, cyber leadership is a new concept that needs to be built on in the schools. And you asked about, well, how do we integrate that in the schools? This is how. This is called cyber leadership. There is cybersecurity, there is information security, there's leadership. There's no thing that brings them together. You do have CISOs, directors of information technology. You have information technology staff members or what have you, but you don't have anyone with cyber leadership. And I'll tell you where this example was, and you can go look at it. When the Colonial Pipeline was shut down, there were so many things that happened there that I said, judging from the answers that I was hearing the CEO and their representatives say, I said, some things might not have been in place according to NIST 800-82 revision 1, 2, or 3, whichever one they wanted to use. However, what they said was when they got in, if you recall, they had to go to a hearing for the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
And for the Senate. And one of the senators, one of the Congress people asked them, do you feel that cybersecurity is important? He said, his answer was, yes. Why? We spent such and such and such and such and such and that much dollars on IT, on the IT budget. That was our IT budget. Now, to you and I, that still didn't answer the question.
No.
But to the Congress people, that answered the question. Why? It's because they don't really understand cybersecurity from a standpoint of how is cybersecurity being run, which goes into one of the courses I teach at Grand Canyon about cybersecurity law and privacy practices and what have you. And we talk about the difference between cybersecurity law or law period and why it's so hard to catch up with cybersecurity. Obviously, the SEC is starting to put some things in place, and people are losing their minds. Like, well, we shouldn't have to tell, and this is an incident. And
well, you don't have to tell the details of it. You need to talk about how you're managing it.
Correct. And who's responsible for that? Now, there's a lot of people who have the authority to handle that, Terry, but the people who are responsible for that are the leaders. And if you're not well versed in cybersecurity or specifically trained in cybersecurity, a CISO, a you, a me, then they won't know exactly how to handle that, and they'll force it under IT and say, go do that, CIO.
I mean, don't you, I do a lot of board presentations, right? And I get the feeling that, and most of them up to the point where before I met with these boards, I think they look at cybersecurity like almost like a foreign language. They don't know what is being said at all.
Well,
and
you're right. That's one of the major things that happened with the Target and Home Depot breaches. Both of those breaches, well, what research shows is that both of those breaches, there were some precursors, some things that gave them a heads up, so to speak. But because the techie folks, for lack of a better word, could not translate that to the business, to the C-suite, the C-suite was not adequately told about the severity of the vulnerability. They did not understand the severity, because I have to believe that anyone who is responsible and who wants to take due care and and actually do things as far as due diligence, that they would specifically, when you're talking about boards, take actions to protect the organization. If someone comes to a CEO and says, hey, if you don't do this, then this will happen, not in a thing of doom and gloom, the sky's falling, nothing of that nature. But to translate it to a point where a CEO will understand this means that.
Bingo. That's right.
You know?
Well, and I think that's how we initially connected up, was on duty of care risk analysis, right? Our common interest, or as practitioners, is duty of care risk and the Center for Internet Security Risk Assessment method. I think that's where you and I kumbaya'd, was over that. Well, and going back to the Target case, Judge Magnuson on that one basically proclaimed that was a plain old negligence case, that the leadership was negligent in its obligations to perform duty of care in protecting not just the customers, but everyone that could be impacted by how they do operations. That was what he ruled. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons why I've done risk assessments, obviously using 830, but I really like CISRAM because of the fact that, especially we're just talking about like an IG1 assessment.
Yeah.
Where you're actually looking at impact in 3 different areas, right? So you're saying impact here, impact there, but impact to reputation, and you look at it like, well, it might not affect operations as much. It might not affect this as much, but it affects the reputation or the other organization, or it might do harm to their clients.
You're talking about the mission, objectives, and obligations, the central fundamental core concept of the CISRAM.
Yes, as opposed to being one-sided as far as, in which I've used, 830 a lot. That has its place as well. But the reason why, and usually when I do it, I take that piece right there and go over with the executives to say, I want a business. I don't want an IT person answering that. I want a business person answering that, because I want to see how does someone having a lost laptop affect your operation, your mission, your operation, your objectives, and then your obligations.
Yeah.
And when they always get to the data part, I sit and watch, and they go, well, if our data's gone or compromised, then how do we then protect our customers? I'm like, that part. They're like, oh man, that's and then it goes up, right? The severity goes up, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my goodness. And then when they go down through the controls, obviously using the spreadsheet, go through the controls, it's glaring. There's a red 9 sitting there like, oh wow, it didn't affect my mission, but it affected my obligations. Well, since that one's a 3 and this is 2 and this is 3 and 3 is 9. So now they're like, oh my, and I hate to say it like this, but it's beautiful for executives to see red, yellow, green. That's what they pay attention to.
They're used to seeing that. Am I good? Am I not good? That's all they run. Are we good?
That's
and if we're not good, what's the problem, and what do we need to do to get to good?
Right. And you have to have, but see, Terry, and I know you've been in as long as I have, you probably longer. You see both sides of security, right?
Yep.
You see the person that comes from we're locking everything down. This guy, he used to work at Chase, now he works at Safeway, and the scanners won't work. Why? Well, our new CISO locked everything down, and you're like, what? And they go in and they implement the controls or what have you, or the policies and procedures, without doing a risk assessment. Because
not balancing the business need, right?
That part, it's a thing where you want to do common sense information security, right? You want to make sure that you're protecting the right thing. You are putting the money. I always tell my students, if you have a Lamborghini and you have a garage and you have a Datsun B210 sitting out, and in the garage you have the Datsun B210 sitting in the garage with the steel door, cipher lock, plus a guard standing outside and a Doberman at the back door. That's over secure. But your Lamborghini is out on the curb. So you have the tools and the resources to secure something, but you're securing the wrong thing. And I asked them, well, if I stole your B210, how would it affect you? Oh, well, if I stole your Lamborghini, how would that oh, that would cost me this, I would lose money, I would do this. Right. So it would make sense to put the security on the thing that is that you value the most, that is the most valuable to the business. That's the part, Terry, that the CEOs never seem to get, because one, usually the security people are buried under the CIO. And in a lot of colleges and universities, they're buried under the CFO. As a matter of fact, the CFO runs IT. And a CFO only thinks what? Dollars.
How much can we get by with maybe 1% or 2% less than you spent last year, right?
Correct.
Versus what's needed to actually get to an acceptable level of risk. And let me take this back to the college theme, because how much of this governance, kind of risk management, getting to an acceptable level of risk, reasonable controls, burdensome controls, all these concepts that are actually fairly kind of newer as far as in the lifespan of what cybersecurity has existed. These are recent, in the last 5-10 year type concepts. How much of that is even discussed at the universities right now for the kids?
Well, I can tell you I can only speak for my class and for our in the classes that I teach. It's not so much written into the curriculum. It is written into some assignments, but it's nothing, unless it's a risk assessment class, there's nothing that's highlighted to say you need to be thinking about this security. We don't see that much because of the fact that the developers and the professors, you got to understand where we get our professors from, right? So a lot of the professors that are there are old school computer scientists. Well, some of the professors out there, old school computer scientists that have been teaching in classes.
DBA.
Yeah, they've been teaching in classes for 20 years. And I don't want to take anything from them. They have several publications and journals or what have you. Great. But I was doing it today. So I'm bringing it to my students to say, let me tell you about this. So to answer your question, how much of it is in? Not much, unless you have a professor that has direct experience with that. And I do know some of my colleagues who have direct experience with it because we both work together. We're the folks that are the CISOs by day and college professors at night. You know what I mean? So we don't do that. However, the Grand Canyons, the Purdue's, those colleges and universities are always querying us to see how they can develop courses that meet the student where they are, and then provide the student what they need to get a job when they leave. And that's the key, Terry.
So let me ask, this is a very, very important question that I guess I want to make sure that I understand what's happening in the universities, but also just to let our viewers know that I think this is a problem. How much in the compliance and standards space is being discussed? And there's a very, very, so is there any awareness at all talking about, and I think there probably is, but even in the professional space with my clients, I see this confusion all the time, and that, say, the HIPAA security rule, one of the first requirements is to perform a risk assessment and perform ongoing risk management. And of course you get onto all the controls, et cetera. Clients literally think like that. They view it as another control. They don't understand that the risk assessment was meant to figure out to what extent do you implement the controls, or which ones do you need to even implement at all, because you may not have, you may have an acceptable level of risk. The word reasonable and appropriate is right in the standard.
So, okay. So I'll tell you why. So I do a lot of third-party vendor evaluations for clients as my role as a CISO. And I have clients that the first thing they do is send me a SOC 2 report. They're like, wham, I'm compliant, I'm good. I wrote an article about this on LinkedIn. Security and compliance are two different things. Okay? Compliance is not security. Okay. If you implement the correct security, you will comply with several different regulatory agencies or what have you. The issue comes in is specifically when you talk about that is about the HIPAA rule or PCI DSS or any of those is because the clients don't see the value of a risk assessment because of the fact that when it is delivered to them, it does not relate back to operational objectives.
So we've done, as an industry, we've done a really poor job in performing our risk assessments. And I think that's why you and I kumbaya over DACRA and CISRAM, because of that new language that we're able to provide the executive management team. What I'm hearing is risk assessments, we haven't done a good job in really communicating to the business side. That's why they got disinterested in risk assessments in past years. So I think you were kind of explaining to me what do you do to solve that? And I know, again, we've kumbaya'd over, we have come together over duty of care risk analysis and how that's performed. But what have you done for risk assessments to keep the business engaged?
Well, the first thing I do is I use, obviously, the CISRAM tool, which I find that to be very, 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 I don't know, easy for us to actually display to the business. What I do is when I do risk assessments, the first part of my risk assessment of CISRAM is with the executives. Okay. I don't include any of the tech guys, guys, girls, and I go over asking them, the business folks, what is your number one, define your mission, define your operational objectives, and define your obligations. And then I go into helping them to understand the inherent risk criteria, and I break it down based on the asset classes that are listed on the RAM worksheet, and they start to see how it works. It's a thing where, for example, I would say, if you lost all your access to your devices, or your device was compromised, what impact would it have on your mission? And they would say, oh, that would be devastating. Well, would it be devastating, or could you buy another one and come back up? And they're like, oh, well, I guess I wouldn't. And then when I get the data, and let's say it's a school, it's a higher education. Yeah. It's higher education. Then all of a sudden wait a minute, if they get my data, then that affects my campus, that affects my operations, but most of all, it affects my obligations, because I have donor info, I have this info, I have that info, and I am obligated to a lot of state, local, and federal regulatory agencies that say, you have to do this. So if my data is gone, the overarching damage that will go forward is catastrophic. I'm like, that part right there. So then when we step down, and I let them go.
Yeah.
And then they're very interested in how everything else pans out. So they go away. Yeah. I sit with the tech folks, and we go down the CISRAM. And then when they see it on the worksheet, they go, well, why am I more risky here than I am risky there? And I'm like, well, you said that this device wasn't if you lost the device, it wouldn't be as risky. But if you lost your data, it would be catastrophic. And then they look in the CISRAM, and their entire all of the safeguards listed in the number 3 control is red, and they're like, oh my. I'm like, that part. And then we get into understanding, and they ask, how do I do that? And I'm like, you need to separate IT from IS, and you need to establish governance and management. Governance is on your side, executive. Management is on their side. And especially in the situation of having a system, like a state community college system, I advise them to keep the governance up there with the state system, and then push the management of the controls or whatever, the tactical part, down to the schools. And I say, as long as you folks meet or exceed a valid, reliable, and defensible standard, you should be good. So in all instances, I make them have a risk, a program, and a control framework. And here's the beauty of that. If they choose, or right now, the program framework that I suggest is the CSF, but they can change out their risk framework. They can change out their control framework. And all of it maps because of the fact that governance is driving and then validating that the practice of the controls, which is strictly management, are being implemented. And then when they realize, well, hey, the deans don't want us to take away their admin access to their labs. Okay, well, that's when we get to do the work. We're doing common sense cybersecurity. I'm like, okay, well, most of these folks have these servers. Let's put that on a teaching VLAN that is away from the outside world, and you guys can go and do whatever you want to do on that, as long as you meet these standards. Keep it updated. Let us know when it's updated. Make sure you have EDR, the campus EDR client or agent on there, and then go from there. And those are the kind of situations where you actually have to have a CISO to kind of translate the business and the the information security, without muddling it up with the IT. I don't care how you use your widget. I just want you to be secure.
And so what I've heard is that the CISRAM has helped you with that translation from the teams, technical teams, to the business. And this might be a good time for our little commercial break real quick. So our sponsor for this podcast is Reasonable Risk. So I know you have a little bit of familiarity as you've seen it, but it's the only SaaS cybersecurity risk management tool, SaaS tool, that is based on duty of care risk. So if you're trying to automate CISRAM and you want to get out of spreadsheets, this is the only tool on the planet that can help you do that right now. So I just want to thank Reasonable Risk for their sponsorship today, and thank you for spending time today. But let me transition. So you gave us good background on all of your campus history. Take me up to more present, where you're kind of CISO at large for a lot of campuses and maybe some other organizations. Tell me what you're doing today as a CISO at large.
What I'm doing today is rolling out cybersecurity programs for all of my clients. All my clients are having my model of cybersecurity program implementation rolled out. They come to me and say, well, we have to comply with HIPAA, we have to comply with PCI DSS, we have to comply with GLBA, we have to comply with all of these people. And my thing, what I say to them is, well, the first thing we need to know is how risky you are. The second thing we need to know is, do you have the policy to make sure it happens? Do you have the policy to make sure it happens today, and the policy structure behind you to make sure you meet it tomorrow and beyond? And that in turn dictates which controls you have in place. And a lot of them use NIST 800-171. They use NIST 800-53, and they found that it was a bit difficult. It's hard. I'm like, well, yeah, it is. But if you use what I've found for my clients, when they're using CIS, and then I map it back to the NIST CSF that's driven, in the NIST CSF that is driven by the risk assessment or the results of the risk assessment, they get it. And so that's what I roll out. I'm like, hey, you need this. And then all of a sudden it lights up. For businesses, so you mean to tell me I shouldn't have this under the CIO? I'm like, no, you shouldn't. You should have a CISO.
Yeah.
Because the CIO has all of that to do. Not having it, I don't have anything against the CIO. I used to be a CIO, but it's you need to have someone that has a firm focus on the one thing that could be the one thing that is so small that can do the most amount of damage. It's not the fact that a server broke. It's the fact that someone broke into the server and now they're all over your network. So I introduced them to MITRE and the anatomy of an attack using the cyber kill chain. But I relate it back to the business to say, if I took away those recipes to your number one selling consumer good, what damage could I do to you?
Yeah.
Oh, it's like that. Oh, it's like that.
Yeah, they don't have to know the technical piece. They just have to understand what the impact is, right?
Right. That's it. And the impact based on what they do. So one customer, they do a lot of BYOD, and I'm like, well, that's fine. You can keep BYOD. However, you might want to roll out a mobile device management process. You might want to step up your DLP. Wait, what's that? You might want to make sure you do vulnerability scanning. You might want to actually use an EDR tool, but it's their devices. Now you have a business decision to make. Is it easier for you to use those devices, or is it easier for you to strike a deal with the device distributor and issue those devices out to where you have all the control? And then they start making those kind of decisions and go, well, yeah, I probably need to do that. I'm like, only if it's important to you. If it's not important to you, then okay.
It's so much good information. With the fact that you've been helping a lot of young folks get ready for the working world, I think you're in a good position to answer this question. So this is the Security Leadership Podcast. What key skill sets do our future security leaders need to make sure they really hone to be successful in that, director or manager, CISO role of the future? What, maybe it's one, maybe it's two, maybe it's three. I won't limit it, but I want to make it, kind of focused in on what do they really need to have to be successful?
Number one, awesome people skills. Okay. You've got to have awesome people skills. And when I say people skills, I mean you have to have insight into actually utilizing your emotional intelligence to understand the people that you're dealing with on both sides of the fence. Okay. Number two, you have to have great communication skills. And when I say communication skills, I mean you should be able to translate up and down the chain. You should be able to take what the executives tell you and translate it to your subordinates or your two levels below, or you should be able to take the information from the two levels below and translate it to your executives, even if they're not in your line of work, in your functional area, or what have you. You must have a firm understanding of how to communicate in business terms and technical terms, especially as a CISO. Number three, you need to understand your valid, reliable, and defensible standards. You need to understand what's happening now. Cybersecurity is very important. Now, that's great to have your CISSP and you have your this and you have your that. But as a CISO, you have to consistently go to webinars and you have to read and you have to be hip on the regulations, the things that they're doing in New York, things they're doing in California. And you think, and how does that affect your business? You have to kind of be the expert in the room. So, but you can't make anything happen if you don't understand how to build relationships, which goes back to number one, people skills. So people skills, communication skills, and become the subject matter expert in cybersecurity. If you have those three things, then I think you'll be a great CISO. That first thing, I put those in sequence. People, communication, subject matter expertise.
Because they won't want to listen to you if you can't communicate it correctly, no matter how good a subject matter expertise you have, right?
No, you'll be sitting in the corner by yourself talking about cybersecurity. Because if I say safeguard and control to an executive, they're like, what? What does that mean? They sound like the same things to me. How does that affect me? Why do I need to care?
Put it in their perspective, understand how to float over into their chair and understand from their perspective.
Well, and you know where that comes from. And that comes from the people skills of being empathetic, you're understanding. You don't have to agree with the other side. You just need to be able to be on the other side and see how that executive could have that opinion. You might not agree with it, but if you were sitting in that chair, you need to be able to say, I see how he could say that, because he or she probably just came from a board meeting and gotten chewed out about an incident that went on that CNN found out about it before she did or he did. That's a problem.
the biggest issue I see from folks coming up from the technical ranks, they're more junior now, they're putting in leadership roles, is they tend to default to what's comfortable, and they'll default to starting to talk technical speak, and they're in front of an executive, and that executive is going to check out within 20 seconds. They're gone.
Pretty much.
They lost them.
Pretty much.
And so I can't agree with you more that they've got to be able to understand the business speak, and they sort of lose a sense for who's their audience, right? Don't drop into the stuff that you know and comfortable with. You got to float over into their world, and that's it.
Yeah. Right, because ultimately you have to convince that person to, number one, endorse you. Number two, fund your fund your initiative. You got to have a champion in the business. You got to have a champion in the business. And well, you have to be able to answer, well, why? Because an executive will ask you that. I mean, you explain to them about, the threats and the risks and things of that nature, and they intertwine those two. They're like, a threat is a risk. No, it's not the same. Risk has likelihood and impact, of the threat. It's not a risk yet until you do likelihood and impact.
Right.
That is what you have to translate. And you have to be able to answer the question of, well, it hasn't happened yet. Why can't I worry about that when it happens?
Yeah.
You got to be able to answer that. Because they're spending money.
It's like having the threat of a flood in your house, right? So the rain is the threat. The risk is the basement getting full of water or whatever, right?
Correct. Correct. Yeah. Right. And what is the likelihood, and what's the likelihood of that? Well, it might rain, it might not. I don't have a proper seals, and then the impact.
Let me redirect to another topic that's pretty hot in the CISO community. There's a lot of burnout. The average tenure is not getting longer, it's getting shorter for the CISOs. I love to ask the question of, how do you keep sane? What do you do to reset? What do you do to, ease your mind and just keep your sanity in check in this role? Just describe what do you do for fun?
Well, I have a 13-year-old child. So I have a 13-year-old son. I live in the state of Texas, and the religion here is football. So I spend my time chauffeuring him around, taking him to camps. And I, too, am a Little League coach. So I go and take off my CISO hat and just go out and watch those kids and have fun and teach them fundamentals of football while teaching them about, teamwork and things of that nature. Integrate that stuff in. But nothing helps you better than helps me better than to sit out by myself in the wind. I'm an avid cigar smoker, and I sit down and I get after my day is over, I get on my patio and I light up a nice Maduro and stare at the stars when I can, because my patio faces due north, so I can stare at the stars and the airplanes, and I have my dog out there. It's the simple stuff, Terry. It's the way to disengage. It's not a bunch of people. And I sit out there and I have fun. I just sit. I don't take any electronics out there. Well, I take an iPad sometime to watch some of my recorded shows. But after that, I just turn that off, and I might put on some music and set my speaker out there and just decompress.
Do you keep a active playlist going on an iPod or anything like that?
No, I don't have an active playlist. They're pretty good now. The Pandoras and the Apple Music.
Just put the station on and run,
and then let it run, and then 9 times out of 10, I'm not really thinking about anything. I'm just, thinking of just sitting out. I don't even think about the next part of my day. I think about what I've accomplished, but I also, Terry, I'm a Christian man, and I just, sit and thank God that He gave me another day. So that's it, man. Mm-hmm.
Well, Preston, I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk with me today.
Anytime for you, man.
It's good stuff for the world to hear. So till next time.
All right,
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. I'll take it easy.